This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Gwyn K, Politi, Jan H, Tanya T, Veronica S, Gabby, Helen M, Ruth S, Sunny H, Scott K, JRM, Susie G, Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B, CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G, V! V, and Mary Beth R. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content. So please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke, and this week we are going to get to a figure who I'm actually kind of surprised I haven't covered her before. When I think about the topics that I cover, not only the ones that are of personal interest to me, but in terms of academics, of the things I've written, and so on and so forth. I've done a lot of focus on Greek and Roman. I've certainly talked about the goddess Morrigan, but I've not talked about Queen Maeve, and she is going to be the subject of today's podcast. Now, there are a lot of stories about Queen Maeve, and she is a rather interesting figure because, like Morrigan, she is one of those where there are at least certain aspects of Morrigan where people say, was she a real person? Was there a regular queen who achieved some kind of legendary status? Was she an ancient goddess and didn't really exist as a person at all except in folklore? Or is there some truth that's in between those things? And of course, the short answer to that is we don't actually know, like with a lot of these things. I think most people today assume Queen Maeve is a legendary figure rather than someone who was an actual queen. But again, it's like with a lot of things in medieval Irish history, it's not always easy to tell what's true and what's not true, especially things that are told through the lens of the Christian monks who wrote a lot of these stories down that may have been part of an oral tradition in the past. Now, where the name Maeve itself means intoxicating because it comes from the word for mead, okay, and it has to do the idea that this was an intoxicating woman, and the one thing she is most definitely associated with is sovereignty. Okay, so that because she is basically the kingmaker. The men do not become kings unless they have slept with Queen Maeve. Now, she does bear resemblance to another figure who is called Maeve Letderg, or is it Letderg? I'm not sure I'm saying it quite correctly, but she is considered to be the sovereignty goddess of Tara. So the fact that there is a Maeve who is a queen of Connacht, which is out in the western part of Ireland and is considered to encompass what we would think of as the western province. Ulster certainly was to the north, and then we would see Connacht. And of course, there were other provinces in Ireland as well, of course. But the seat of the High Kings was at Tara. Maeve's father was said to be one of the High Kings, who installed her as queen in Connacht at Cruachan, which is now known as Rathcrowan. And I've talked about Rathcrowan with respect to the Morrigan's cave, which is known as Oenigit, or the Cave of the Cats. And that is a story directly connected to Maeve. But to not get ahead of myself here, what I want to do is I want to talk about Queen Maeve, whether she be person, whether she be legend. I want to start by talking about the stories connected with her. And I decided the most complete source for that is O'Hogan's Myth, Legend, and Romance, an encyclopedia of the Irish folk tradition, which is a pretty reliable academic source on the topic, rather than relying on, not that Wikipedia is always bad, but sometimes it gives a good summary. But I think that the information here, I think this more concisely sums up all of the stories about Queen Maeve for the purposes of our podcast. That would be the most expedient thing to look at. Now, some of the big topics that we're going to talk about in connection with her stories, which after I have gone through them, is first of all, we're going to talk about her as a sovereignty goddess. And something that's known as the Banashrigi, which is a kind of a ritual of kingship that involves a woman giving the cup presenting the cup to the person who is going to be the next king, and that connection to Maeve. And for that, I'm using Bart Jaskie's Early Irish Kingship and Succession as my source on that piece of information. Anybody who might have seen my Morrigan presentation in London, not this past year, but the year before, when I was talking about Morrigan, I mentioned this source there as well. And it's very interesting that this connection between the feminine and sovereignty. And of course, Maeve being a queen that represents that, obviously we want to talk about that particular idea. Plus the idea of Maeve as a hero maker, because there are other stories, which we will talk about, in which she is the one who will decide, which hero is the bravest. And we also want to talk a little bit about the connection between Maeve and the Morrigan, because there's a number of places where they overlap, and sometimes there are people who will mistakenly interchange the two. Now, they are two separate beings. They're not the same, but they have some of the same attributes, which is rather curious. And while that is a rather long and complicated thing to look at in terms of studying it, we can certainly talk about it more as an overview. When my book Phantom Queen comes out from Theon, which, again, should be later this year, I think it's currently under review right now, that book is going to definitely delve into all of these little rabbit holes regarding the idea of, it really focuses on Morrigan, but there's a lot that's said there that could also be said about Maeve, at least in parallel. The idea that how much do they represent aspects of sovereignty, aspects of the land? How much do they represent, to what degree are they land goddesses of Ireland? And of course, their representations in medieval literature are also, both of them are portrayed as being kind of manipulative and sketchy. So, so we want to look at where those things overlap and what that might mean. And then I want to talk about some other interpretations of Maeve, particularly the idea of Maeve as a fairy woman or as queen of the fairies, which I believe is actually, spoiler alert, I actually don't think that is a correct association, though there's some things there that maybe we can talk about. So those are the main points that I want to talk about concerning Maeve. Obviously, after this podcast, if there's other aspects of Maeve that people have questions about or are curious about, do let me know, because I could always do a part 2, or I could also make this one of my live stream discussions. And of course, these all go up on YouTube, both the podcasts, which are published on Spreaker, and obviously those of you who subscribe to the audio version, wherever it is you get your podcasts from, the main site that puts them out is Spreaker. I also put everything. I make a video version and put everything on YouTube. So some of you who are listening to this are watching this on YouTube and listening. Others listen to this in the audio version on Spreaker or your own podcast app. So the video on YouTube is going to be everything. It will be the actual podcast in video form. And of course, the live streams that I do on Instagram, where I do as a follow-up to these episodes, will also be there as well. So definitely, if you're somebody who only follows the audio, you might want to check out the Chthonia YouTube channel and subscribe and see if there's going to be any other updates that follow this. So let's get on to Queen Maeve and let's talk about her. I'm going to read this from O'Hogan's encyclopedia. As I mentioned, it was Myth, Legend, and Romance, an encyclopedia of Irish folk tradition. And Maeve is spelled, now, the way that I'm spelling it for this podcast is MEDB, and that is, in Irish, that is pronounced Maeve. There are a number of other spellings that are related. He is spelling it MEADHBH, where you certainly have the idea of mead in there as well, but that is a later Irish spelling. And of course, a lot of us, the anglicized version is Maeve, Maeve, usually. A lot of people want to say Medb or things like that. It's Maeve. And just, by the way, the book I have called Maeve is not about Queen Maeve, but the name's certainly an interesting one. And okay, so she's listed as mythical Queen of Connacht and a leading character in the Ulster cycle, which is a cycle of Irish legends and myths. The name originally meant one who intoxicates and was used to denote the goddess of sovereignty. Early Irish sources often symbolize the gaining of kingship as drinking ale pro-offered by an otherworld woman. A character called Maeve Leitderg, that was it, was associated with Tara. And a fortress there was called Maeve, after her. Her epithet means half-red and probably referred to the bloody contests for the Tara kingship. She is represented as having had several husbands. a typical role for a personification of sovereignty. And one medieval text gives a typical description of her role. Great indeed was the strength and power of that Maeve over the men of Ireland, for it was she who would not allow a king in Tara unless he had had her as a wife. The text further describes her as a shrewd and wise woman, being fierce and merciless. The description would be appropriate to her namesake, Maeve of Cúailnge, which is now Rathcrowan in County Roscommon. This queen of the province of Connacht was also said to have had several husbands, and the literature invariably portrays her as a great manipulator of men and an adept at power and intrigue. Moreover, she is said to have been reared at Tara, and there is little doubt but that Maeve of Tara and Maeve of Cúailnge were one and the same personage. Okay, well, that's his theory. I don't know. There's maybe other theories about that, but yeah, seems likely. Symbolizing the Tara kingship, the power struggle between the Connacht sept, which ruled there, and the Ulstermen of the north, brought her cult into contact with that of the mythical Ulster king Fergus mac Roch. The power struggle of the 4th and 5th centuries is reflected in the Tónbo Cooley, an epic which was first assembled around the year 600 AD, when the name of the Connacht sept had become synonymous with the Western province. Thus, tradition came to situate Maeve's power center at Cúailnge. Regarding her husbands, one recension of the Tón has her boasting, "I never was without one man in the shadow of another," and she attempts to gain the great bull of Cooley by offering its owner the friendship of my thighs. One early account states that Fergus deserted his native province out of lust for her. Yes, in fact, I think it was the way it was described was he abandoned his people for the buttocks of a woman or something like that. It is clear that the dramatic potential of portraying her as a sex object was recognized from an early date, and that she quickly developed from a symbol of sovereignty into an attractive and cunning woman. Interesting, right? We are told that her husbands, in consecutive order, were Conor mac Nessa, who was the king of Ulster, Tinny MacConnor, Eochaid Dalla, and Ailill MacMata. She left Conor after a short time of marriage due to, quote-unquote, pride of mind, and returned to Tara. Later, we are told Conor visited Tara and violated her while she bathed in the river Boyne. Fidach MacFaig, I could be wrong, please don't shoot me, came to woo her, but he was intercepted and slain by Tinny MacConnor, king of Connacht. Eochaid banished Tinny to the wilderness and installed Maeve as queen of Connacht and Cúailnge. Eventually, she took Tinny as a husband, but he was killed by Conor in a battle at the Boyne. Maeve was rescued from that battle and taken back to Connacht by Eochaid Dalla, whom she then allowed to be king of the province on condition that he marry her. Ailill MacMata was a mere child when he was first brought to Maeve's court, but he grew up to be a fine champion, and she deserted Eochaid Dalla for him. He is the husband who figures in the Tón epic. In surviving recensions of the Tón, the whole series of events is portrayed as being caused by the pride and scheming of Maeve, and this is the result of the increased dramatization of her personality. She seeks the bull of Cooley in order to have her wealth equal to that of her husband. She schemes to enlist the support of Fergus and other powerful allies in her attack on Ulster, and she unremittingly plots to destroy the young Cuchulainn, who stands in the way of her ambitions. Moreover, she insists on herself being the leader of her assembled armies and belittles Ailill, who she sees as having less determination than herself. One account shows him as a frustrated husband, as he views her relationship with Fergus. One day, we are told, he noticed the shaking of a hazel branch near the royal court, and on going to investigate, found Fergus and Maeve engaged in sexual intercourse. He took the sword from Fergus's scabbard and put a timber one in its place, vowing not to return the weapon until the final great battle of the Cattle Raid. When this latter conflict was over, Ailill took his revenge on Fergus by having him slain by a javelin cast when Fergus was cavorting in a lake with Maeve. The jealous way in which Maeve guarded her power is demonstrated by one reaction which is ascribed to her in the Tón. When she reviewed her troops and noticed the impressive troops of the Gaelin set, she feared that their prestige would so grow on the campaign as to outshine her own Connacht contingent and perhaps threaten her power. She therefore decided to have them slaughtered and was only dissuaded by the indignant objections of Fergus. She then decided to have the Gaelin warriors divided and dispersed among her forces. The Gaelin were a Leinster sept, and this passage is an echo of the ancient hostility between the Connacht Axis and the Leinstermen. Maeve's confrontations with Cuchulainn, of course, had the attractions of high drama. In the initial stages of the cattle raid, she affected to be dismissive of his ability, but soon was brought to view him more seriously. She slyly invited him to come unarmed to parley with her, and when on his charioteer's advice he did not fall for the trick, she prevailed upon his friend Fardiad to oppose him in single combat. Thus she did by making Fardiad drunk with ale, promising him her daughter Finnevar as a wife, and taunting him with cowardice. Cuchulainn, who frustrated all her schemes, increased her hatred for him by humiliating her whenever they came face to face. At one stage during the campaign, he shot a pet bird from her shoulder, and later came upon her when she was alone and menstruating. She begged him to spare her when he did so, not being a killer of women. Eventually, Maeve had her revenge. She had the children of Caitlin trained in magic and sent them to kill Cuchulainn, by which an ingenious manipulation of circumstances they succeeded in doing. And this is actually part of the Morrigan story as well. But the portrayal of Maeve in the Táin whetted the appetite of medieval audiences, and accordingly more narratives were composed. We are told that she would only take a husband on 3 conditions: that he be without stinginess, without fear, and without jealousy. There is obviously some echo here of her original function as a goddess of sovereignty, but this echo again was dramatized. On account of her lax moral standards, her husbands could not allow themselves the luxury of jealousy, and so, until his patience finally snaps, Ailill is portrayed as an extraordinarily tolerant of her affair with Fergus. The condition of tolerance, however, did not apply to herself. When Conall Cernach was exhausted from his horrific campaigns against her men, the great Ulster warrior made peace with her and went to recuperate at her court at Cruachan. He spent a year there, and meanwhile Maeve had noticed that her husband Ailill was keeping company with one of her ladies-in-waiting. She was overcome by jealousy and prevailed upon Conall to slay Ailill, which he did by a quiet javelin cast. Maeve, however, treacherously announced to the Connachtmen that Conall was the culprit, and so encompassed his death also. Her own death is described in an 11th century text. There we are told that she killed her sister Clothra, who's also known as Etna in some of them, or Etne, who had preceded her as queen at Cruachan. Clothra had resided on an island in Loch Ree on the River Shannon, but had been slain by Maeve there. A baby boy was delivered by putting swords through her side after her death, and he was called Furbade, literally the cut one. Maeve herself went to live on that island and used to bathe every morning at a spring there. Once, when a great assembly was being held on the shores of the lake, the young Furbade saw a beautiful woman on the island going to bathe. He inquired who she was and was told she was his mother's sister. He had been eating cheese, and on hearing this, he put a hard lump of cheese in his slingshot and shot it with such accuracy and force that it struck her on the forehead and killed her. This, like many of the accounts of Maeve in the medieval literature, was a rather spontaneous composition with no tradition behind it. Furbades in a different account, indeed, was the son of another sister of Maeve called Etna. Okay, yeah, so there's the 2 different names that show up. In both cases, his father is claimed to have been Conor MacNessa, but in his other account, he is said to have been cut from his mother Etna after she was drowned in a stream. The writers were obviously dealing with a jumble of names and were arranging them in a narrative order by use of whatever motifs suggested themselves. Maeve's husband, Ailill, for instance, was rather awkwardly claimed to have been a grandson of another of her sisters. I think it's pronounced Aila. Maeve appears in a background role in several stories of the Ulster cycle, such as the Feast of Brí-Cruach. Yeah, we'll talk a little about that. The Intoxication of the Ulstermen, this has to do with Cuchulainn, and the Adventure of Nera. And through symbolizing basic traits of the ancient goddess of sovereignty and war goddess, her character as a power-hungry virago was very much the creation of the medieval literati. Apart from some onomastic recollections, she does not figure at all in the later folklore. So let me mention the Brí-Cruach story, because that is the one that connects her to, it connects her to the name Owenigit. And in this particular story, Brí-Cruach is a satirist. And a satirist, I've mentioned this in other podcasts, satire is one of those things people do not like to be made fun of, especially if they are somebody who are known as a valiant hero for valiant deeds. You remember that this is a time when one's immortality is guaranteed by their heroic deeds. So if you have someone there who is making a joke out of you and making fun of you, that's not how you want to be remembered for all time. So you really try to avoid the satirists. They really did not have much of a sense of humor when it came to this. That said, these kinds of people, those who engage in satire, kind of like today, actually, you think about it, when you think about how many of our modern comedians who are on late night television and so forth really get under the skin of certain people who want to appear heroic. it's kind of it's a similar thing there. Definitely with the ancient Irish heroes, you can see this almost, well, like most heroes, there are these fatal flaws of sorts. And they're the same kind of fatal flaws that we sometimes see in ancient gods. For example, at the Judgment of Paris, we see Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite all arguing over who's the fairest, right? Well, the Feast of Brie Cru, nobody wants to attend his feast because they don't want to be lampooned by him. So what he does is he says, okay, I'm going to have the feast and I'm not going to be there. So he leaves the feast there in his house and everybody can go enjoy themselves without him being there. However, on the table where there is this beautiful choice cut of meat, there is a sign that says that this choice cut of meat is for the bravest of the heroes. And so naturally there are 3 heroes, and I don't have the story in front of me, so I'm not even sure I'd be able to say the names of the other ones right now, but I know Cuchulainn is definitely one of them. In any case, the 3 of them they all are arguing over which one of them is entitled to this particular choice cut of meat. And eventually Queen Maeve is called in to settle the discussion. And what Queen Maeve ends up doing is she sends them, one of the things that she has them do certain tasks to show the fact that they are, their bravery. And one of them is to wait outside the cave at Crohan, which at that time was just the cave at Crohan. It was the Morrigan's cave. And it was an entrance to the Otherworld. And they need to be there at night, to stand guard there at night. And what came out of the cave were these big black, like panthers, these big black cats. And 2 of the men were frightened and they ran away. But Cuchulainn actually stayed and fought with the cats. And I cannot remember if he just subdued them or if he killed them. But in any case, after that, Owenigit literally means the cave of the cats. And that's where that story comes from. So through Cuchulainn's passing of these different tests that Maeve had set for him, Cuchulainn is then judged to be the one worthy of having that feast. Now you think about it, if this is a piece of meat that's been sitting out, that's a choice piece of meat, and they're out like all these days, like doing all these contests, I'm like, wouldn't the meat be pretty bad by then? But anyway, I don't know. I'm being way too literal about this. It's funny, I always talk about, don't get so literal about these things, and that's exactly what I'm doing. But, so in any case, this is one of these contests, and Maeve is the one who oversees this Feast of Brie Cru. Now there's, now the other story here, okay, that in particular I'm going to mention is the Adventures of Nera. And that has to do with Samhain, and it has to do with the same, well, pretty much the same cave, the same location. Obviously, since Maeve is Queen of Connacht, Rathcrowan, just for context here, Rathcrowan currently is in, and it just means the Rath or the fort, the Cruhan fort is basically what that means. And if you go into Western Ireland, there's a little town called Tulsk, Tulsk. And in Tulsk is the Rathcrowan Visitor Center, where you can go. It's right next to, unless it's changed since then, it's next to O'Connor's restaurant and bar and all that, which I think is the only game in Tulsk. And it's right near Anne's B&B, where I have actually stayed. Anne and Noel Sheeran own it, and it's a lovely little place. I think there's a couple gas stations around, petrol stations, and then there's a church with a cemetery more or less across the street from that. And the site of Rathcrowan itself, you have to drive about 5 kilometers out of town down the road, and it's on the left. You'll see there's a huge parking area, and you can see the huge mounds that are connected with the area. And there's a lot of them. There's some that are on one side of the road. There are others on the other. It's spread out over a very wide expanse. And somewhere, I'm trying to decide. I mean, I'd have to, on a map, I want to say it's to the east of the rest of the complex. I could be turned around, but it's basically when I was at Rathcrowan, we had to go farther down that same road, and I feel like we were heading back in the eastern direction. But there was another little side road with a couple of houses and so forth, and then there's a little hedge, and behind that you see the sign for the Cave of Owenigit, which is there. It's a little, almost a yoni-shaped opening that's like an upside down triangle. And you can actually go into the cave. It is very, very muddy, but that's where they refer to it. They also refer to it as the Gate of Hell, because obviously that's their interpretation of the Otherworld must be hell. but I won't digress into that discussion. But in this Adventures of Nera, this is the context, this is the area in which that takes place. And so on Samhain, Maeve and Ailill basically offer a huge bounty or reward for whoever will go out and basically tie what I think the equivalent of tying like a string around the toe of one of the corpses that is laid out at the on Samhain. The thing is, that's a very dangerous thing to do because the corpses can reanimate and come back to life, or they're still occupied by spirits of some type. And so it's very dangerous. There's certain things you're supposed to put on your door to keep and ways that you're supposed to fasten your door to keep the dead from wandering into your house. And if you don't have all of those things in place, the dead person can come in and sort of breathe on everybody in the house and kill them also. So what happens here is that Nera decides he's going to take up the challenge. Now, of course, he's scared to death. He goes out and he finds this corpse, and he goes to tie this little cord or tag or around its toe, whatever it is he's trying to do. And he doesn't get it quite right the first couple times. Then the corpse wakes up and instructs him on how to do it. But then after he does it, the corpse says, "Hey, would you mind picking me up? I need to, I could use a drink of water. I could use this, that. Can you just carry me to this next place?" And so he ends up having to pick up this corpse and carry it around, and then it would be at each house, and then it would go and it would try to walk into the houses. But again, if they had put the proper precautions and locks on their on the front of their whatever their equivalent of houses are there, then the corpse couldn't go in. So he'd be like, all right, well, let's go on to the next one. And then eventually he would walk into a house and the family wouldn't be prepared. And then he would kill the entire family, just by breathing on them. Basically, by virtue of all this, somehow Nera ends up in the Otherworld. And he ends up meeting a woman. He gets married. He has like a whole family. Like all this stuff happens to him. But then he finds out that the Tuatha Dé Danann are actually getting ready to fight Queen. They're going to come and they want to come and slaughter all of the humans in that vicinity. So he manages to get back to this world in order. And it turns out it's the same day. Basically, he comes back and he is able to warn Queen Maeve and King Ailill that this attack is coming. So they're able to be prepared for it. And therefore, the attack of the Tuatha Dé Danann is thwarted. But he does go back to the Otherworld, and he stays there with his new wife afterward. So that's the Adventures of Nera, and that is where Maeve. It's simply Maeve's court where this is happening. So it's really more of a tangential kind of story. But the so-called Cattle Raid of Cúailnge, or the I think they say the Tawnbo Cooley. I always said it was 10, and then I still heard it was Tawn. That is an interesting story, and that one does involve the Morrigan as well. But basically, just to summarize that one a little more so than O'Hogan does here, it says, okay, I'm just going to read this one from Wikipedia. Maeve insisted that she be equal in wealth with her husband and started the Cattle Raid of Cúailnge when she discovered that Ailill was one powerful stud bull richer than her. So in other words, they were having a disagreement over who had more wealth. Pillow talk at night, over who has more cattle. And cattle, of course, were a way of measuring wealth in ancient Ireland. And so she comes to find that he has this one bull called Finbanach, which is a white bull, and there is the Dun Cooley, which is a big black bull, which lives in Ulster, and it's owned by Dairy Mac Fiachna, which is a vassal of Conor, which is her former husband. So she sends messengers to Dara, offering wealth, land, and sexual favors, as O'Hogan says. How did he put it? The friendship of my thighs, offers her that. But when the drunken messenger declares that if he had not agreed, the bull would have been taken by force, Dara withdraws his consent, and Maeve prepares for war. An army was raised, including contingents from all over Ireland. One was a group of Ulster exiles led by Conor's estranged son, Cormac Conlongus, and his foster father, Fergus MacGroch, former king of Ulster and one of Maeve's lovers. It's reported that it took 30 men to satisfy her, or Fergus once. So a real virile gentleman there. Maeve's relationship with Fergus is alluded to in the early poem Canail Maeve Michuru, I think is how you say that, and I could be completely wrong, but it's Maeve has entered into evil contracts, okay? It asserts that Maeve wrongly seduced Fergus into turning against Ulster because he preferred the buttocks of a woman to his own people, right? Because of a divine curse on the Ulstermen laid by Macha, the invasion was opposed only by the teenage Ulster hero Cuchulainn, who held up the army's advance by demanding single combat at fords. Maeve and Ailill offered their daughter Finnebhar in marriage to a series of heroes as payment for fighting Cuchulainn, but all were defeated. Nevertheless, Maeve secured the bull. And during a final battle against Conor's assembled army, she was forced to retreat. Dun Cooley was brought back to Cruachan, where it fought Ailill's Bill, Finnebhar killing him, but dying of his wounds. So in the end, she went to war to get this prize bull, and she wants it to fight with her husband's bull. So you have this black and white bull fighting each other, and then they both end up dying. So it's a big waste, basically. Cattle raids are not uncommon, by the way, in ancient Ireland. That was a thing. A lot of times when somebody was declared a king of a particular province, the idea that he could go and loot and steal cattle from his neighbors was actually considered to be kind of it's almost like a hazing or initiatory thing. That was something that did happen. So Maeve is, as you see, she's kind of portrayed as this very tricky kind of character, somebody who's very proud, has to be the one who is the best, who is jealous of her power, who guards her power. But of course, you have to also remember that this is largely a medieval interpretation of Maeve. Now, if we talk about her as being relating back to the idea that she is a sovereignty goddess. Oh, and let me actually, before I go there, I just want to back up for a minute. The story of her murdering her sister, okay, that's interesting because Maeve literally kills her and then gives her a C-section, and that's what we would call it now, and takes her son out, which is interesting. And then that son decides that he is going to get revenge on Maeve for killing his mother later on. But nonetheless, if the fact that this would be attributed to Maeve, it generally portrays her as being ruthless. Her husbands have to tolerate her infidelities, but she doesn't have to tolerate theirs. She has this sort of all-encompassing power. When I think of her, if I think of the tarot and I think of the Queen of Wands figure in the tarot, Queen of Wands is a Maeve figure. Redheaded, fiery, ambitious, beautiful, desired, but also somebody who wants to be the one in control. You have conversations with people about whether they like the Queen of Wands' personality or not. That's the way that it's viewed, as somebody who's just being very, very ruthless. And interestingly, some people would say almost masculine in the way that she goes about things. We often associate that kind of behavior with patriarchy, right? The idea that a woman is going to that kind of power-hungry idea. And oftentimes that sort of power-hungry behavior comes out of an insecurity. But again, it's hard to know because it does get back to the question, if you were talking about a real person, okay, which I don't know. We don't know whether there was a queen if there was a Queen Maeve, if there was somebody like her. Supposedly she's buried in a cairn on top of Knocknarea, which is in County Sligo. I have tried to climb up there before. I am not a person who does well with heights. And I actually did pretty good until I got to this one staircase that goes up that has no railings on either side. They're very narrow, and with the sign saying, if it's wet out, these are going to be slippery. And there are 2 gulfs on either side of them. And I was like, okay, if I'm here by myself, if I fall and trip and fall, even if I make it up, I may not make it down, then I'm screwed. I'm going to have a broken leg and no way to get to anybody. So I didn't actually end up climbing those stairs. There is another way up on the other side, but this was the most convenient way for me, not being somebody who drives and so forth when I'm in Ireland. So sadly, I was almost to the cairn and I didn't quite make it. But her cairn is on the top of Knocknarea, and you can see it from a number of different points in County Sligo. And also, if you go out towards Yates Country, towards Drumcliff, and that way, Knocknarea is usually visible near the Glencar waterfalls and places like that, which are nearby County Leitrim. This is where, and she's said to be buried standing upright to face her enemies. Yeah, so the question then becomes, okay, you have this fierce warrior queen, and she also seems to be connected to sovereignty. Okay, in fact, she's most definitely connected to sovereignty. And there were a few different points that I found to be quite interesting. Okay, so first let's talk about something that is known as the Banish Rigi, okay, which is the idea of the woman providing the cup of sovereignty. So I'm going to read a little bit about this from Jaski's book, Bart Jaski. Again, I mentioned this was early Irish kingship and succession. This is around page 69. Let me see if I can find the spot, because he does mention Queen Maeve in connection with this. And he says, just as the handling of a drink binds a king with the goddess of the territory, so does intercourse, as the activities of the promiscuous Queen Medb of Cúailnge, alias Maeve Leitderg, show. Maeve has a number of husbands whom she picks because of their particular royal qualities. They have to be without meanness, without jealousy, and without fear. Such queens are also found in stories set in the historical period, among whom the most notable is More of Munster, whose death is even interpolated in the Annals of Ulster. Maeve, More, and other women or queens can be regarded as sovereignty figures because they marry with successive and often rival kings in the territory they represent. Remarkably, even historical queens acted in this fashion. From genealogies and annals, we have some suggestive examples of Irish kings marrying the wife of their predecessor, which seems to indicate that queens were sometimes treated as sovereignty figures during their lifetime. The most convincing evidence comes from queens who were married to successive kings of Tara. In the Annals of Ulster for the year 768, the death of Chthonia, Queen of Kings of Tara, is recorded, a strong indication that she had been the wife of 2 or more kings of Tara in succession. Chthonia is not mentioned in the Banchentjes, so one can only speculate about the identity of her husbands. Her father, Bresol, was the son of Fenachta Fleadach, the king of Tara. Both father and son were slain in 695, and none of their descendants achieved any prominence afterward. So whoever married Chthonia apparently did not do this to establish a political alliance. It is thus possible she was married because she embodied the kingship of Tara. So we're going to skip over some of these other examples that they mention. It says the similarities between the themes of women incorporating sovereignty by marrying successive kings and the above marriage ties are quite apparent, and it suggests that the symbolism of marrying one's predecessor wife was not lost on the kings of Tara. This does not mean that it was customary to marry the wife of one's predecessor, but it occurred often enough to suggest that the literary motif of women embodying sovereignty was sometimes acted out in reality. Of course, it may also have served other political advantages, such as continuation of a marriage alliance or humiliation of one's past rival. Unfortunately, we know too little about the political circumstances under which these marriages took place to state anything with certainty. But it's remarkable that, for example, among the Franks and the Longobards, the marriage to the widow or of a predecessor carried, besides other advantages, the implication of a right to rule. And he says, so now we may return to the question of how the term Banashrigi, wedding feast of kingship, came to be applied to a royal inauguration ceremony. On both occasions, acceptance of a drink at a feast served by a woman means the acceptance of the bond which was established between the two parties. Sexual intercourse carried the same meaning. In addition, several sources state that a poet had a right to the wedding clothes of the couple, just as he could claim the ceremonial clothes of the newly ordained king. He says that it is possible that in the pre-Christian period, the Irish kings were inaugurated in a symbolic wedding to a goddess representing the territory. However, the early medieval period, Banish Rigi, say nothing about how a royal inauguration ceremony was conducted in the historical period. O'Reilly's theory that the king of Tara was symbolically espoused to the goddess Eru at his inauguration, while lesser kings were similarly married to the local goddess, remains unproven for the historical period. Okay, so he gets into the whole idea of the medieval structure. But nonetheless, what we're talking about is this idea that there is a historical precedent for marrying the previous queen, that queen is going to take multiple husbands to her because of her representation as a goddess of sovereignty. Now, there's a whole lot of other things connected to the sovereignty ritual, some proven, some unproven. There's a suggestion that a horse is sacrificed and that there's a brine or a broth that's made. I don't know if it's from the horse or from the urine of the horse. I can't remember what all the exact details of it. I mean, it is pretty gruesome, but that the king is supposed to drink that mixture, or he's supposed to have intercourse with the horse and then they sacrifice it. There's something to that nature has been described. But of course, this is written in a text that was not necessarily friendly to the Irish. So it's really hard to know whether that was a real thing or not, or whether this is just somebody's, in the same way that people maybe looked at early Christians and said, oh, they eat the body and blood of Christ, so they're all sitting around engaging in cannibalism there. You don't know if it's like one of those interpretations. You understand? I don't know. You don't know if it's something like that because there doesn't seem to be any other mention of that kind of ceremony anywhere else. And of course, the horse aspect of it would tie it also to the sovereignty goddess, particularly Macha. And that draws us to the parallels between Queen Maeve and the Morrigan. Now, just to be clear up front, I'm not suggesting that these two are the same. Morrigan does literally mean Great Queen or Queen of Phantoms. There is this idea of queenship among both of them. And if Maeve is represented as a sovereignty goddess connected with Tara, as Morrigan is as well. Morrigan shows up in these stories as a war goddess who brings about terrifying visions. Whoever side she's on, she is definitely urging the side she's chosen onto victory, which is also an act of sovereignty, because the idea is if you are fighting for a territory or a piece of land or whatever you're fighting for people's possessions, their cattle, then that is also an act of sovereignty. Sovereignty is about what you rule over, okay, what you have. And Morrigan is very heavily connected with that, particularly her Macha aspect. Now, if we go back to Ulster, here's a piece that I find interesting. Conor mac Nessa is the same king who has the fairy woman Macha run a chariot race with him. There's a man called Cruniac. And Cruniac is an Ulsterman who, there's a very beautiful woman who his wife has died, and now he's known to look after his children because he has to go in the fields and work and whatever he's to do. But this really beautiful woman comes running at top speed towards him, and then she just comes, and he realizes she's coming running into his house. And as soon as she comes into his house, she immediately just takes over. She comes in, she takes care of, gets the kids in order. She starts doing the housework and the cooking. She has sex with him. I mean, she basically just shows up and becomes his wife. And he's like, okay, apparently that was fine by him. But the way that she can do certain things and the speed with which she can run makes him convinced that she's a woman of the Otherworld. And Macha, and she doesn't give her name as Macha until later. But she basically tells him, look, whatever you do, don't talk about me and the things that I can do. If you want everything to continue as good as it's going, like, just let alone. He's like, oh, yep, okay, fine. Well, one day Conor mac Nessa has a big festival. And at this festival, of course, they're all drunk. And this is what I was saying about heroes earlier. Heroes have flaws. And one of the flaws is obviously they have no sense of humor. So they can't stand being made fun of. But the other flaw that they have is that when they can get very boastful, and they can. It's the same way like when you get into these drunken arguments and say like, oh well, I can take you, haha, you're nothing, and they get into these kind of boastful yo mama kind of matches with each other, and. So what ends up happening here is they're all drunk at this festival. Now, Macha is pregnant with twins right now. Cruniac, she's excused from having to come to the festival that's been called because she's pregnant and she's in labor actually at the time. So what happens is the king brings out his beautiful new racehorses and he brags that these are the best racehorses. Nobody's horses are as fine as my horses. And Cruniac, who can't resist at this point, says, my wife can run faster than your horse. And everybody looks at him, and and of course, they're about to like imprison him and kill him for saying this to the High King. And he says, well, then you bring your wife out right now, and she has to prove it. So they get sent to the house, and Macha says, well, she says, yeah, I'll run the race, but let me finish delivering my children first. They said, no, you have to come right now, or else your husband's going to die. So she goes out. While she's in labor, she runs this race against him, crying in pain. And of course, they said it's a really horrific scene because this woman, and also just being humiliated by the fact that she's got a child half coming out of her womb, and she's being forced to run. So she runs the race and she wins. Okay, but she gives birth to her twins and they're dead. And so she lays a curse on the Ulsterman. Okay, this is the curse of the Ulsterman. The debilitation of the Ulsterman is what this story is called, and basically says that in their hour of need and I can't remember if it's 9 days, 9 nights. There's like kind of a number there that they will suffer labor pains at their hour of need, and they will not be able to fight. And this is what happens when Maeve's army comes in. Now, it's interesting because this king is Conor mac Nessa, and this is the one that Macha lays her curse on. Now, of course, people have talked about the idea of Macha as a horse goddess here, because she is the idea that she can run very, very fast would make her very much like a horse. And then she's forced to run like a horse. And there are other stories about this, but I do talk about that elsewhere. I am going to be talking about it in the book. But there's some legends from Transylvania that are of a very similar nature. But I don't want to digress into those stories. What I find interesting here is that, obviously Macha hates Conor mac Nessa because he did this to her, and then she ends up cursing all of Ulster, which is a place that it was pretty highly favored by the Morrigan, actually. And in fact, in the battle, it's interesting because Morrigan, she does things to encourage the Queen Maeve side. I mean, she also is a cattle stealer. She definitely gets herself enmeshed. She's the one who tells the Dun Cooley. She goes to him and says, "Hey, somebody's about to steal you. You should run away." So of course he does. And then the cattle has to be pursued. Like she kind of sticks it in on both sides, both Maeve's side and also on Cuchulain's side, because she wants Cuchulainn to be her champion, but see, Cuchulainn approaches the Morrigan and Maeve in the same way. When they offer him those sexual favors, he refuses. So, in a way, I just find myself thinking of Circe or Circe and Odysseus when she doesn't get her way through magic, so she offers him sexual favors. Like, this is one way of gaining power over men, perhaps when you don't have the brute force to be able to do something. But there's some similarities there. And at the same time, Morrigan is the one who is there when Cuchulain's death is finally brought about by magic. By this kind of magical, I think it's basically somebody appears to him in illusion. Again, I don't have the names in front of me right now, but I know that somebody who he has promised he's not going to come and go into battle appears before him and says, "Go into battle." And so he says, "Oh, okay, so now I'm going to go into battle." And later I find out, no, she was never there. She never said that. That was like a glamour that was thrown. That was an illusion. But it's too late, because Cuchulainn now goes into a situation where he ends up meeting his doom. And of course, the Morrigan, in her crow form, usually considered Baeve, which is B-A-D-B. Baeve is considered to be kind of her crow form, ends up sitting on Cuchulain's shoulder, and that's how they know, how they're able to tell that he's dead. But there's a whole story around that. But it's interesting because, first of all, he rejects both of them. When Morrigan appears to him as Macha, as a regal woman, and basically offers him sovereignty and offers him victory in war, he tells her, "Well, go away, woman." And when Queen Maeve tries a similar thing. She tries to overcome him with sexual favors, but he won't be swayed. That earns him the consternation and the anger and the wrath of both Morrigan and Maeve. So in this particular story, we see that Maeve is actually a bitter enemy of her ex-husband, Conor mac Nessa. In fact, it's said that she renames all of her children, and I'm not sure if it's pronounced men. It's M-A-I-N-E, which we would say Maine in the United States, but I don't know I don't get the impression that that's how it's pronounced, because a druid told her that one of her sons, because she has 7 sons and 2 daughters, and that one of her son who's called Men or Maine is the one who's going to kill Conor. So she renames all of her sons men. She changes all their names. And one of them does actually kill Conor, but it doesn't happen to be the right Conor. It's a different Conor. She doesn't specify which one, because Conor is not a somewhat common name. And so it's a different Conor who ends up being killed. So she didn't really specify that part of the prophecy. But she hates Conor, and Morrigan also hates Conor or Macha certainly hates Conor because of what he did to humiliate her while she was pregnant. So there's some interesting parallels here between Maeve and Morrigan, though they are clearly not the same figure. There does seem to be some overlap in them because they both deal with the idea of sovereignty. And of course, Maeve, as being a warrior queen who wants to go to war and wants to do battle even more than her husband, is definitely falls into this category. It does make one wonder whether or not Maeve's hatred of Conor, and then you have Macha's cursing of the Ulstermen due to the actions of Conor and of Cúailnge, but also because Conor is just being very proud and very boastful, and I mean, well, the Cúailnge Act violated the protocols towards dealing with the High King, but then the way that the High King treated Macha was completely unfair and uncalled for, really, in spite of the situation, because she certainly didn't ask for that situation. So you almost feel like if Macha is cursed to the Ulstermen, you wonder if this curse goes a bit farther. So now there's a challenge to the sovereignty of Conor Nessa coming from Maeve, who, in a way, it's like, you make you think, is she acting as an agent of the Morrigan, or is there a connection between the two of them? If they're both goddesses connected with sovereignty, is there is there a connection between those two? Even though, again, I don't think it's implied anywhere that they are the same, because obviously Morrigan is out doing her own thing. Basically, she's tormenting Cúailnge at the same time that Queen Maeve is attacking them. And really, Morrigan was willing to grant Cúailnge victory in battle, but he also was one who showed disdain for the power of the woman, for the power of the woman who grants sovereignty. Okay, in this case, it was Macha, or it's Morrigan, who is granting that sovereignty, or who is granting that prosperity and abundance. So in both cases, we're seeing this idea of a sovereignty goddess when she has a man who tries to be her better, what comes of that. So yeah, so it's interesting. The medieval Queen Maeve is certainly written as somebody who has all of the ruthlessness of a male king. And as I have often said, war is a feminine thing. It's interesting because I've talked also about the connection between love and war. I did around Valentine's Day this year. I did the What's War Got to Do with It podcast. And Maeve could be another example, if we wanted to view her as a goddess, of somebody who is very seductive and somebody who is also very warlike. And it does make you wonder if at least one of the other connections between love and war, just thinking about this out loud here, is that the fact that that love and sex and that sort of thing is connected with war. Are all love goddesses to some degree sovereignty goddesses? Is there this idea that the one who wins the love of the queen who represents the land, and if you want to think of the land as representing that area which might be prosperous and fertile, and maybe where you have lots of whatever you consider to be wealth, in the case of the Irish cattle, what is the love, are love goddesses sovereignty goddesses? Is that always something that's implied in their nature? Because if they are the queen that is willing to grant their favor, or the queen who is, by taking the queen in an intimate way, that one wins something. That one wins the kingship. One is chosen. I mean, the idea of giving a cup is even connected very much to that idea, because we think of the cup as the vessel. Those of you who engage in witchcraft practice certainly know the symbolism of the sword and the cup, right? I mean, it's the cup is a very strongly feminine symbol. It's a very strongly emotional symbol. Certainly, again, to go back to tarot, the suit of cups, this is the emotional suit. This has to do with what is felt. This has to do, it has a lot of the cards there have to do with love, but they also have to do with the ways in which emotions can be overbearing, or can get us stuck in grief or the past, or make us dissatisfied. Like, it's a very emotional suit. Okay, so the idea of the cup, and the cup as the thing that is that which grants sovereignty, in simplest terms, it could be a metaphor or a symbol. It can symbolize the sexual act, by the idea of giving the cup to the man. In the idea of, similar to offering the friendship of one's thighs, it might be, if we think of that as being quote unquote the cup, that definitely shows this interesting connection there. But the medieval writers, again, coming from this more Christian slant, and maybe even to a certain degree, later writers perhaps were not necessarily writing from a slant that was particularly favorable towards the Irish generally. That's another thing I think that we don't consider. We definitely consider the role of the Christian monks and wanting to put down the old religion. But given what the Irish have been through since that time, there may have also been an attempt to some degree to maybe put down the Irish. Although that's just one way to look at it. When Maeve is being shown as someone who's like conniving and scheming and manipulative, then at the same time, she's someone who's seductive and she has many lovers and her husband can't be jealous. There's this idea that a woman cannot wield that kind of power if you're looking at it in the social political sense, at least from the perspective of those who ruled Ireland afterwards, shall we say. The ones whether you're thinking about it in a religious sense or whether you're thinking about it in a political sense. Certainly, Maeve was definitely a representation of a feminine force and power that was said to be conquered and also just been treated as something somehow as loose and immoral, a phrase that I think I've heard in Ireland. I think it was when I was there in it wasn't 2015, it was 2013 that I think I was in Ireland for a period of time, for the first time, really. And that was the first time reading in a Galway newspaper when they were first discussing an abortion ban, or rather lifting the abortion ban. That was when that was first being discussed. That was the phrase that was used by the local bishops, that you cannot allow these things for women because they will engage in loose behavior. So Maeve is portrayed as the loose woman, but she's also a woman. And this is it. You have these loose women. Look at all the power that they're going to wield, right? I don't know. I don't know that Maeve is said to be a cautionary tale. Eventually, she does die when her sister's son, her nephew, really, sees her, and he's basically gets his revenge on her. But as O'Hogan notes, that one it seems to be something that doesn't have any. There's no other connecting tradition. There are no other recensions or anything that connect that version of Maeve's death to anything else. And of course, it sounds very ignoble. He just basically is eating a piece of cheese. And I want to know what kind of cheese that was. I mean, if it's like a brick, he was able to take it with a slingshot and hit her in the forehead and kill her. It's a very ignoble way for a very powerful queen to go out. You could go farther and go into the symbolism of cheese. What is cheese? Cheese is made from milk, right? Whereas milk, comes from cows and cattle, but it does jump into my mind. Like, yeah, think about what that is. It's this representation of one, at least part of the wealth that might come from cattle, certainly from cattle who are from female, the female cows, And this is the thing, and it's something in this particular form that ends up hitting Queen Maeve in the head and then killing her. So, I don't know. You could potentially, if you wanted to go down that road, you could maybe read something into that. But nonetheless, I still think it's just meant to kind of give her this ignoble end to a great queen. And of course, to allow for some kind of justice for what Maeve does to her sister. Because that's a pretty gruesome act when we think about it. And obviously, yeah, you're talking about a period of time where powerful women would be demonized because they were not, if she had been a queen and then somehow St. Patrick showed up in the middle of it and she converted to Christianity, then I'm sure, that maybe she'd have a different reputation. But, or maybe her power would be, a gift from God or something like that, But the fact that she has there's this interesting connection between sovereignty, love, and war. And it seems to have very much to do with the idea of the earth as not only granting its fruits, and which we think of in terms of fertility and prosperity, and that's something we definitely connect with sex and sexuality. Especially when we just think of the way in which things reproduce themselves or regrow themselves, but also the idea of war, that in order to maintain the prosperity that you have, sometimes you have to fight off invaders. And Maeve becomes an embodiment of that, whether she was a real person or not. And it's interesting to think about. The last thing I want to talk about with Maeve is the way in which people have suggested that she is connected to Queen Medb, which is mentioned really primarily as a Shakespearean invention as the Queen of the Fairies. Because there's some sense here that Queen Maeve, she's definitely the daughter of a High King of Ireland, but she has this element to her that is almost otherworldly. We see her connection with the cave at Cúailnge, right? The fact which is often associated with the Morrigan and the Morrigan's appearance on Samhain to keep her annual tryst with the Dagda. We see Maeve connected to, she has to be the one who is the kingmaker. She is the one that decides, who's going to be king. Because there's an element of judgment there too. There's a sense of discernment. Who has the right qualities to be king, and who's going to choose the sovereign. So it's almost as though she's acting as a kind of agent of sovereignty for a sovereignty goddess, or she is being conflated with the sovereignty goddess herself. So the truth probably lies somewhere in between. But to talk about Queen Medb for a minute, I just want to read you a little bit about the origin story of Queen Medb. It says, Shakespeare may have borrowed the character of Medb from folklore, but is debated, and there have been numerous theories on the origin of the name. A popular theory holds that Medb derives from Maeve, a legendary queen from the 12th century Irish poetry. Scholar Gillian Edwards notes that little resemblance, however, between the two characters. There's a marked contrast between the formidable warrior Maeve and the tiny dreambringer called Medb. Other authors, such as Wirt Sykes, argue that Medb comes from the Welsh Mab, child or son, though critics note the lack of supporting evidence. Thomas Cately suggests a connection to Habundia, or Dame Habond, a goddess associated with witches in medieval times and sometimes described as a queen. A more likely origin for Mab's name would be Mabel, and the Middle English derivative Mabili, as used in Chaucer. Also, all from the Latin word amabilis, meaning lovable. Simon Young contends that this fits in with fairy names in British literature of the time, which tended to be generic and monosyllabic. Mab was a nickname for a low-class woman or prostitute, possibly for a hag-like witch. Similarly, queen is a pun on queen, Quean, term for prostitute. Okay, so now, although one could argue, given the portrayal that people have wanted to make of Queen Maeve, the idea that she is this extremely powerful warrior woman who grants sovereignty, who has many lovers. The men, men don't control her; she controls the men. Sort of being turned around here, and we're talking about a term. You have a term like Mab being connected to prostitute, which would certainly be a moralized reference to Queen Maeve's promiscuity. But you also have this idea of turning her into this little dainty fairy woman, in the same way that that fairies definitely have a much more terrifying backstory, and are potentially very dangerous forces. They can be helpful or dangerous. Really, they're not evil forces, but they can be very, very dangerous. And the way in which literature, British literature in particular, especially as we get up through the Victorian era and onward, turns them into these just cute little, winged creatures that look like little babies or little people, sitting there, sipping the little cups from the flowers, and just looking like these little cutesy figures, kind of like they do with angels. They're trying to make them just look like these little adorable, harmless, cutesy things. So to me, it's not necessarily that far-fetched, the idea that Mab could have come from. They're saying it comes from amabilis, which may well be the case, and I feels like because Maeve actually has its origin, as I said, in the word for mead, which has to do with that honeyed, intoxicating drink. And of course, honey has another reference to it as well. But so they don't seem to be quite the same. But nonetheless, the idea that those two concepts might potentially overlap with each other, and you have this idea of a queen who used to be now a big, powerful queen, reduced to this cutesy little figure, basically bringing dreams to people. They don't bear any similarity to each other, but that could potentially be the point. Nonetheless, it does seem like Mab probably does come from that Latin root, and therefore is not connected to the Irish Maeve, in spite of the connections that people have tried to make. But there's an interesting similarity there, and I do wonder if the word Mab, the idea of Mab, is having to do with love, from this Latin root amabilis. I don't know. There seems to be some connections, but I think etymologically, probably the two words are not connected to each other. But nonetheless, interesting concept that the word Mab, even in Old English, would be something that is connected to somebody who might be a prostitute. So, I mean, there's certainly the original sense of things. I have often talked about the fact that ancient religion, probably in a lot of cultures, does not, while they all have their rules, their taboos, their boundaries, they don't all necessarily follow the same morals and moral code that we think of, but that we tend to have adopted in connection with what we'll probably say in Europe, I think it's safe to call it mostly a Christian tradition, certainly a monotheistic tradition. Anything of that is pagan, there are certain taboos that are observed among tribal kings and chieftains, certainly, that are connected with the way in which they rule, with the furtherance of the tribe, of the family, of doing certain deeds. I mean, there's different rules that certainly in ancient Ireland you had the idea of Brehon law, where you could have several marriages, quote unquote. You man could be married to several different women. Similarly, a woman could be married to several different men. Marriage just meant basically that you had sex with each other. And if a child comes out of it in particular, then that's a marriage. And if either party's unhappy, a divorce is possible. But the divorce does require, certainly in the case if there is a child, that the man take care of the child, that he provide for that child, even if he is no longer married to the woman. So it's not a concept where we had later on, where you have this idea of marriage where, you're married to one person and you're faithful to them for life, or you practice celibacy, or this, that. Yeah, the way in which sex was demonized, certainly a very sexual queen like Maeve would be demonized in that way of thinking. And the idea that she also held power would have been viewed certainly as almost a type of witchcraft or something satanic in a way. So, although I don't know that's a term they really would have used so heavily at that time, maybe, but nonetheless, that would have been devilry, certainly, because anything that we read from the medieval texts about witchcraft, it always brings this sexual aspect into it and shows it as evidence of consorting with the devil, or trying to steal souls or whatever, which I've talked about in other podcasts as well. So interesting. Yeah, I could probably go on about the subject, but I think we could just say in summary that Queen Maeve is someone who, she's definitely one of those love and war goddesses in a way, or goddesses, or if she was a real queen, she has taken on these characteristics of a sovereignty goddess, who is definitely connected to who gets to have rulership of the land, who gets to decide. Later myths, like that of Dame Ragnell, would show that woman who grants sovereignty as being kind of an ugly old hag, rather than a seductive woman. So, yeah, I think the key thing we're looking at here is the attitude towards not only women's power, but women's sexuality and the connection between the two. A theme that continually reoccurs in a lot of different cultures about the power of sex and sexuality, and has to make us reflect nowadays on why people seem to think that women's autonomy is something that shouldn't be in their hands, because, I don't know, Lord knows, maybe they'll turn into a Queen Maeve and conquer everybody. I don't know. It's definitely reinforcing the fear and power that one has of a woman who is not only powerful in terms of her mind, but also in terms of her body. And that, certainly for the medievalists, probably was a big no-no, at least according to the official accounts. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. If you have any other questions about Maeve, definitely leave them for me in comments, and I will be happy to try to address them somewhere. If you are not a follower of my Patreon and you would like to be, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I do offer extra stuff, extra podcasts, episodes, and some other sneak peeks, previews of things, and regular updates to Patreon members. And also they get the first crack at the podcast a day before everybody else on a limited access link. I have a website at chthonia.net that is being updated. I have 5 books coming out this year. 5 books on my own imprint. They've all been kind of stacked up, and I've been finishing them up, and I've got 2 out to the publisher now, one coming out May 1st, one June 1st, and then there will be ones coming out July, August, and September as well, in addition to whatever Theon does with Phantom Queen later this year. So there's a lot of stuff coming out, but please check out chthonia.net/publications to see the news about everything that is going to be coming out in terms of books in the near future, and also for links to acquire those books if you would like to. I also am on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word, Instagram and X. And just to mention, I do live streams on Instagram, usually at noon on Mondays. If it's a different time, I will post it in the morning. I usually post a little thing about a couple hours in advance saying, hey, live stream at this time. Sometimes it's 12, sometimes it's 3. But I do those and upload those to YouTube. So I do a lot on Instagram. X, I'm on there occasionally. Usually I'm just posting the podcasts. And I'm also on Facebook as Chthonia Podcast, 2 words. And if you're not watching on YouTube, there is the Chthonia channel there. Do consider subscribing to that as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next episode.